Kiowa resonated with me the most because of his identity and persistence. He maintained his Christian religion and his identity as being a Native American despite being discriminated and made fun of. Although O'Brien never explicitly says it, we can assume at this time most of the other soldiers were white or not minorities. Therefore, he was picked on for being different. An example of this is when on page 116, when O'Brien states, Dobbin left, an Indian preacher, man, that's one I'd love to see, feathers and buffalo robes. Another example of this is when Bowker says, that's a smart Indian, shut up. So they pick on him for his identity and being Indian. However, Kiowa never responds negatively or picks fights. For example, when Dobbins makes fun of him and says feathers and buffalo robes, he responds by not speaking at all. He controls himself and doesn't defend himself or anything like that. He instead continues to rely on his faith and his New Testament to persevere through the discrimination. Kiowa has the power to influence readers because he stands out from the other soldiers. Kiowa does not submit to toxic masculinity present in the platoon. He is described on page 156, he is described as Kiowa had been a fine soldier and a fine human being, a devout Baptist. So he out of everyone there is known for his high morals and his Christian faith. Despite the horrible conditions of war, he maintains his own personal morals, and therefore he motivates the audience to persevere and not surrender to peer pressure, as in his platoon. Another example of Kiowa's morals is when they are camped out at a church. The platoon settles at a church, and when they do, Kiowa says, "It's bad news. You don't mess with churches." And then at the end of the chapter, he says that the fact that they have set up at a church, he describes it as just wrong. He believes that churches are holy places and should not be messed with, especially in times of war where the men are sinning and committing acts of violence. In addition, Kiowa doesn't want God to see his acts of violence and his sins. He was forced into the position of soldier through the draft, and he doesn't want the fact that he was forced into being a soldier to interfere with his religious life. Kiowa's death also invokes admiration and impact. He experienced a brutal death that confirmed the cruelty of war. He is known for dying in the ship field, as it is described. His death affected the soldiers greatly, displayed by each soldier's tendency to blame themselves for his death. The platoon believed that he did not deserve to die, and this unexpected death impacted them greatly and caused pain as well as the trauma of loss. When he died, only a small fraction of his body remained. On page 166, it says, "Nothing showed except the heel of a boot." This demonstrates that war destroys even the hope of humanity. The purity and light that Kiowa was in the platoon was killed. He was killed in an ironic way, not by the Viet Cong or a bullet, but by the land itself and the corruption of war. Kiowa's death exhibits all the other soldiers' respect for him. When he died, the soldiers blamed themselves or others for his death. This is because Kiowa was the beacon of hope in the platoon and represented the light despite the darkness of war. On page 169, Tim O'Brien says, still remembering how he had killed Kiowa, referring to himself. Similarly, Norman Bowker states, nobody's fault, everybody's. Each of the soldiers tried to find someone to blame or themselves to blame. This is shown through page 170 when it says, you could blame the enemy, you could blame the mortar rounds, you could blame the people, you could blame God. They each searched for blame for the injustice of Kiowa's death. In conclusion, Kiowa represents the innocence that is corrupted by war and how his death demonstrates the brutality and lasting impact of war on him and the traumatic experience it caused on the soldiers.